Hey there, friend. Tonight, we begin with the bizarre, ambitious, and occasionally eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty. A world where elegance meant looking like you hadn't seen the sun or a sandwich in years. Where the phrase "you look pale" was a compliment, and where the price of being considered beautiful was slow, decorative poisoning. I'm Silas Whitmore. Let me take you back to a time when makeup wasn't just a cosmetic. It was a calculated act of social survival. When women bleached their skin with vinegar and lead. When drawing blue veins on your chest was considered peak refinement. And when foreheads were expanded, yes, expanded by literally removing parts of your hairline. It was a time when beauty wasn't about appearing healthy. No. That would imply you worked outside, and heavens forbid anyone think you were familiar with a shovel. Beauty was about fragility, pallor, restraint, and suffering in silence, ideally with a powdered face and a fainting couch nearby. So before we descend into this softly absurd and magnificently toxic world together, take a moment to do what the medieval nobility never could: relax. Dim your lights. Loosen your jaw. Take a deep breath in. And if you like my video, comment number 1. If you don't like it, hit the like button anyway. It confuses the algorithm in all the right ways. And while you're here, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it? Are you curled up alone? Or is someone gently snoring beside you? I always love knowing where these stories land, especially when they float in with the night. Ready then? Pull your blanket tight, and let's ease into tonight's tale. Just be grateful you still have your eyebrows. In the Middle Ages, pale skin wasn't just attractive. It was everything. It was class. It was power. It was proof that you didn't work, didn't sweat, and didn't know what wheat looked like unless it was baked into a pie and handed to you by someone beneath your station. You see, tanning was for peasants, people who labored under the sun, whose skin bore the mark of toil and productivity. And productivity, my friend, was deeply unfashionable. The ideal was skin so white it looked like moonlight had personally curated your complexion. We're not talking about a healthy ivory glow. No, we're talking about translucent parchment-esque, borderline spectral, the sort of pallor that made people wonder if you were ill wholly or recently exhumed. Ideally, a mix of all three. But achieving that kind of ghostly elegance wasn't easy. Nature rarely cooperates. So medieval beauty enthusiasts turned to chemistry, specifically the kind that makes your modern dermatologist cry. White lead powder was the holy grail. It gave the face that chalky, flawless corpse chick aesthetic. It also gave you anemia, skin ulcers, and the occasional premature death. But hey, what's a little organ failure when you're setting fashion trends? Some used mixtures of crushed pearls and egg whites for extra glow, luxurious, yes, but also sticky. Imagine your cheeks feeling like a stale meringue every time you smile. Others soaked cloths in vinegar to bleach the skin, then applied layers of chalk dust to seal in the effect. The goal was simple: look like you've never seen sunlight and might faint from the effort of lifting a feather. And it didn't stop with the face. Arms, chests, and even legs, if they were ever seen, were lightened. Veins were sometimes painted on with blue pigment just to drive home how delicate you supposedly were. Because nothing says nobility like pretending your blood vessels are trying to escape your body. Even romantic poetry joined the charade. Women were praised for being white as milk, pale as the snow, or luminous as the moon in winter. Which, if we're being honest, sounds less like romance and more like weather reports from a ghost town. The pale complexion wasn't just a style, it was a statement. It whispered, "I'm so privileged, I can afford to look like a tragic marble statue," and that, in medieval Europe, was the gold standard of attractiveness. Let's say you weren't born with the complexion of a terrified snowflake. That didn't mean you were doomed to be ordinary. No. It just meant you had some medieval chemistry to do. White lead powder was the medieval equivalent of luxury foundation, minus the safety regulations. Made by exposing strips of lead to vinegar fumes until they corroded into a fine white crust, it was then scraped, dried, and ground into a powder. When applied to the face, it gave a smooth, matty finish, the kind that screamed, "I'm rich and slowly dying." It was fashionable, elegant, and just a little bit toxic. Well, more than a little. But beauty in medieval Europe came with a death wish and a vanity mirror. And why stop with just lead many noble women, and some men layered their makeup like modern influencers layer serums. After the lead came rouge made from you, guessed it, mercury. A lovely red flush for your cheeks and a quiet dismantling of your nervous system. For that extra shimmer, some used crushed pearls or powdered coral. Chalk dust added staying power, while egg whites brushed onto the skin created a tight, glossy sheen. It made you look smooth glazed and vaguely edible, like a pastry in distress. Still not glowing enough, enter the vinegar facial. Soak a cloth in vinegar, slap it on your face, and wait for the sting to remind you that yes, beauty hurts. For those who couldn't afford crushed gemstones, cheaper options included a delightful blend of ash ground animal bones, stale bread, or flour. Medieval DIY was an art and a slow-motion chemical fire. And let's talk about maintenance. This wasn't a one-and-done routine. You had to reapply constantly because the makeup cracked under heat, sweat, and shame. The summer months were especially cruel. Your look could quite literally melt off your face. Some women carried small mirrors or had servants on hand to do discreet touch-ups. Others just accepted that by evening, they'd look like a peeling fresco in a damp chapel. Of course, there were side effects. Skin lesions, tremors, tooth loss, and memory problems were common. A persistent metallic taste in your mouth, just part of the charm. And if you started coughing blood, well, you probably looked great doing it. But the effect was worth it. You appeared ethereal, untouchable, like a marble statue that had taken human form. People would marvel at your lack of pores and your ability to appear both noble and possibly unwell at the same time. Men joined in too, especially in Italy and France, where powdered cheeks, styled curls, and a thoughtfully receded hairline signaled sophistication. A properly powdered man suggested poetry, courtly manners, and an aversion to labor. No one wanted a suitor who looked like he knew how to stack firewood. In the end, the look wasn't just about beauty. It was about performance. You didn't simply exist. You presented. You performed your pallor, wore your fragility like a badge of rank, and told the world I am too delicate to survive a real life, which makes me perfect. And if your organs failed by 30, at least you went out luminous. At some point, pale skin alone wasn't enough. It had to look fragile, ethereal, like a whisper wrapped in parchment, which meant your skin couldn't just be white, it had to be translucent. And since human skin unfortunately comes with pesky blood circulation, medieval beauty called for a new trick: painted veins. Yes, painted. Women, and sometimes men, used blue pigments to draw thin, delicate veins across their necks, arms, and even across the chest. The idea was to create the illusion of near-transparent skin, the kind only possessed by angels' ghosts or someone who hadn't touched solid food in weeks. These veins were not meant to be bold or obvious. No subtlety was key. The lines had to be feather-thin, barely there, like a secret your skin was keeping. A hint of blue beneath a powdered cheek. A whisper of delicacy trailing down a wrist. Something that said, I am noble and also possibly dying. And like all good beauty trends, this one came with its own awkward rituals. Some manuals recommended crushing lapis lazuli azzurri, or indigo, into powder and mixing it with water or egg white to create vein paint. Others used plant-based dyes or simply burned linen to ash and sifted the residue. Because nothing enhances elegance like a dab of scorched laundry on your clavicle. Of course there were missteps. Draw too thick and you looked diseased. Too dark and people thought you'd been cursed. Some overenthusiastic artists ended up with veins that looked less like noble fragility and more like biblical plague. Others had servants draw the lines for them, because what says status more than hiring someone to fake your vascular map? This obsession with visible veins wasn't just aesthetic, it was symbolic. In a world obsessed with bloodlines, what better way to flaunt yours than by literally outlining it on your skin? If you were a noblewoman, your veins weren't just anatomy, they were heritage. Blue blood made visible, carefully, tastefully, and possibly smudged by sweat. And it didn't stop at pigment. Some took the illusion further by pressing chilled metal to their skin before events to make real veins rise. Others would fast or dehydrate themselves slightly to enhance that hollow, glassy effect. Because nothing says, "I'm ready for the ball," like mild organ stress. Even poets got involved. Love poems described women with veins like rivers beneath snow or silken threads under moonlight. No one wanted to date a woman who looked hardy. That suggested labor, or worse, exposure to sunlight. And here's the real kicker. If your veins didn't show naturally, it wasn't your fault. But it was in a way your problem. So out came the brush, the powder, the performance. Because in medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was painted just below the surface. If you looked in a medieval mirror and saw two bold, healthy eyebrows staring back at you, you were doing it wrong. Very wrong. Because in the courtly beauty standards of the late Middle Ages, eyebrows were not just unfashionable, they were actively suspicious. Hair above the eyes, scandalous. Rebellious. Practically criminal. The ideal medieval forehead was a smooth, towering expanse of pale skin, a spiritual runway stretching from brow to crown. A high, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just elegant. It was considered a sign of intelligence, chastity, and noble refinement. The bigger your forehead, the closer to heaven. Literally, to achieve this look, you didn't just pluck your brows. You erased them. Some women used tweezers and pumice stones. Others went for more aggressive methods, hot cloths, soaked in vinegar, quicklime pastes, and even mixtures involving arsenic or cat dung. Because, of course, nothing says divine radiance like scorched follicles and questionable hygiene. And it didn't stop with the brows. The hairline was pushed back inch by painful inch, sometimes all the way to the top of the head. This was done by plucking individual hairs, a process so excruciatingly tedious that some noble women hired servants to do it while they sat absolutely still, whispering psalms and regretting everything. Portraits from the time show women with impossibly high foreheads, serene expressions, and faces that looked like they started 3 inches above the average. Combined with the powdered skin and vanishing brows, the effect was unnerving. You weren't supposed to look like a person. You were supposed to resemble a statue that had recently been sanded. But why this obsession with the high forehead? It came down to associations. Low brows suggested animal instincts. High foreheads suggested prayer poetry and emotional restraint. You wanted to look like you'd spent your youth in a convent, not in the stables. And certainly not chasing anyone across a muddy field. And while today's influencers debate brow gel versus microblading, medieval women had a simpler question: do I burn it off, shave it off, or poison it off? Spoiler, they sometimes chose all 3. Fashion, of course, found a way to assist. Cone-shaped hennons, those absurdly tall hats, helped elongate the silhouette. Tight hoods and veils framed the face and hid the damage while reinforcing the illusion of divinely proportioned features. Modesty, sure, but make it cranial. Some women, unable or unwilling to fully remove their brows, simply covered them with ribbons or painted their forehead higher, with pale makeup effectively contouring their skulls before it was trendy. Others faked hairlines by wearing strategically styled caps that made it appear as though their heads had simply evolved. Even men were not completely safe from this trend. While full brow removal was rare, many male courtiers trimmed and thinned their brows to emphasize their own noble foreheads, because in a world where foreheads were power, no one wanted to be caught with a brow that screamed "I shovel things." So the next time you curse a bad eyebrow day, remember your medieval ancestors tweezing their way to sainthood, praying for hairlessness and measuring virtue in vertical inches. In the medieval world, blonde wasn't just a hair color. It was a status, a symbol, a holy shimmer sent directly from heaven, or at least from a bottle that smelled faintly of desperation and boiled herbs. Blonde hair was romanticized across Europe. It was associated with youth, purity, and all the things a noblewoman was supposed to embody while quietly suffering in restrictive headgear. In religious paintings, even the Virgin Mary was often depicted as blonde, despite her Middle Eastern origin. Artistic accuracy optional. Symbolic glow mandatory. If you were naturally blonde, congratulations. You were considered blessed. People might describe you as angelic. You might get out of chores. But natural blondes were rare, and childhood blonde often darkened with age. So what's a medieval woman to do when her divine halo started turning? Mouse brown, she improvised. Enter the world of medieval hair, dyeing a world full of strange alchemy and questionable personal safety. Recipes for blonde-enhancing concoctions varied by region, but a few ingredients showed up again and again: saffron ash crushed, barley lye, rhubarb root, and yesurin. Human urine, preferably aged, was thought to activate the bleaching agents in these herbal mixes. Some sources even specified that it should come from a young, healthy man, as if Renaissance tinder had a setting for sun-kissed bladder chemistry. These brews were applied liberally. Then the woman would sit under the sun for hours, baking the mixture into her hair. The result, sometimes golden, often orange. Occasionally, alarming. For extra lift, some women mixed wine vinegar with goat's milk and honey, forming a treatment that smelled like a picnic gone terribly wrong. Others wrapped their heads in cloth, soaked in ash water, and hoped for divine intervention, or at least consistency. This wasn't a one-time rinse. No blonde maintenance was an ongoing sun-dependent saga. You had to apply the mixture, regularly avoid rain, and angle yourself like a human solar panel to catch the most light. All of this just to create the illusion that you'd been born closer to divinity and farther from manual labor. And yet, for all the effort, visible hair wasn't always allowed. Unmarried women could display their golden locks to signify innocence and availability. But once you got married, your shimmering hair became a scandal waiting to happen. It had to be hidden, covered with veils, wimples, and enough linen to construct a sailboat. So why go through all the trouble? Because even if no one else saw your hair, you knew it was golden. And in a world where your value was often measured by how little you worked, how pale you looked, and how many layers you wore to hide your natural self, having perfect blonde hair beneath your head wrap was a small, sunlit rebellion. In medieval Europe, hair wasn't just something that grew. It was something that spoke about your virtue, your class, your availability, and sometimes your likelihood of being burned as a witch. Let's start with the basics. Visible hair was a negotiation. For unmarried women, flowing locks were allowed, encouraged even. Loose hair symbolized innocence, virginity, and a sort of spiritual availability, like you were a chalice of grace just waiting for the right suitor. But the moment you married, hair became scandalous. A married woman showing her hair was like flashing a secret body part, tame by modern standards, but utterly inappropriate back then. So women covered their heads, wrapping their hair beneath veils, Wimple's coifs, and sometimes full-on architectural marvels made of linen and moral panic. Of course, this didn't stop the competition. Women might have hidden their hair, but they didn't stop caring about it. The hidden hair had to be clean, long, well-maintained, and beautifully scented just in case anyone caught a glimpse. After all, modesty didn't mean you couldn't have ambition. Hair treatments ranged from the herbal to the bizarre. Rosewater, rosemary, mint, and sage were common ingredients used not just for fragrance, but to ward off lice and spiritual impurity. Some recipes advised boiling your comb in wine, then brushing your hair with it to bless your strands. Others involved rubbing onion juice on the scalp to stimulate growth, a method that either worked or at least ensured personal space. But hair wasn't just about beauty, it was moral real estate. Church sermons linked loose hair to lust, temptation, and dangerous feminine energy. Women who let their hair fall in public were accused of being seductive or sinful, especially if they were widows or dared to speak with confidence. And then there were the nuns. Nuns were required to shave their heads upon entering a convent. This was symbolic, of course, renouncing vanity, earthly pleasure, and anything remotely shampoo-related. A bare scalp was a sign of spiritual devotion. But ironically, many convents also kept detailed records of hair care, because even if you didn't have it, hair remained part of the system. Some widows voluntarily shaved their heads after their husbands died, signaling grief and piety. Others did it to escape unwanted attention or rumors. Baldness, oddly enough, could be a power move. On the flip side, overly luxurious hair could lead to accusations of witchcraft. If your hair was too shiny, too long, or too resistant to modest updos, you might find yourself the target of whispers, suspicion, or worse. Because clearly, no normal woman could achieve that much bounce without help from the devil. So the medieval scalp was a battlefield between God and vanity, between modesty and ambition. Whether you covered it, oiled it, plucked it, perfumed it, or shaved it off entirely, your hair was never just hair. It was a message. And like most medieval messages, it was written in discomfort, anxiety, and at least 3 layers of linen. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval noblewoman walking past. What do you smell? If you said roses, lavender, or some delicate floral breeze, you're partially right, but also vinegar, mildew, goat fat, and perhaps just a whisper of panic. Because in a world without deodorant, hot showers, or laundry machines, smelling acceptable was a full-time job. To be clear, medieval people didn't like being dirty. Contrary to popular myth, many bathed regularly when possible, but access to clean water was limited, and the church sometimes frowned on excessive bathing, especially for women. Why? Because apparently cleanliness might lead to sinful thoughts. Which is wildly ironic, considering how many people were already fainting from the fumes of unwashed humanity. So what did people do? They masked it. The medieval solution to body odor was simple: outstink the stink. Noble women doused themselves in herbal waters, rosemary, sage, thyme, marjoram, basically turning their bodies into traveling spice racks. Lavender and rose were favored for upper-class events, while stronger scents like camphor and vinegar were used for, let's say, crowd control. One popular item was the pomander, a small perforated orb filled with aromatic herbs and resins worn on a chain or tucked into one's bodice. It functioned as a wearable air freshener, a holy charm, and a silent scream of please, don't smell my armpits. Clothing was another layer of olfactory defense. Linen undergarments soaked up sweat and were easier to wash than outer garments. But perfume was crucial. Recipes for medieval perfumes often included rosewater, crushed cloves, cinnamon oil, or sometimes ingredients better left unmentioned, like animal musk, ambergris, yes, whale intestine, residue, or fermented roots soaked in brandy. Hair was perfumed too. Combs were rubbed with mint or soaked in orange blossom water. Some women braided small sachets of herbs into their hair or pinned fragrant petals behind their ears. Because when your hygiene routine involves vinegar facials and wool underwear, a little minty scalp goes a long way. Of course, none of this guaranteed results. Summer heat still existed. People still sweat. Medieval fabrics didn't breathe. So parties often smelled like a combination of thyme sprigs, wet wool, and quiet desperation. Men were no exception. They too carried pomanders, scented their beards, and rubbed their doublets with perfumed oils. Courtship didn't begin with poetry. It began with not gagging. But smell wasn't just about attraction. It was spiritual. A pleasant scent was believed to reflect inner purity. Saints' corpses were said to smell sweet even after death. So smelling nice wasn't just good manners. It was a theological flex. So if you've ever sprayed a little perfume before a date, remember you're part of a long, aromatic tradition. One that involves herbs, hope, and hiding your armpits from history. Let's talk about smiles. Or more specifically, the medieval lack thereof. In the hierarchy of medieval beauty, teeth ranked somewhere between optional and absolutely not. A wide, toothy grin, unthinkable. Laughing with your mouth open, practically vulgar. Women were praised for modesty, and modesty meant keeping your mouth and your molars politely out of sight. This wasn't just about etiquette. It was strategic. Dental care, as you might imagine, was lacking. Toothbrushes existed in some rudimentary form, think frayed twigs and linen cloths, and tooth powders were made from crushed bones, salt mint, or charcoal. But the average mouth was still a battlefield of rot infection and breath that could slay dragons. So rather than fix the problem, medieval beauty culture found a workaround: don't show it. Smiling with lips closed became the norm. Laughter was stifled into delicate chuckles. And portraits almost universally tight-lipped, as if smiling too broadly might summon the Inquisition. Artists painted their subjects with serene pressed lips, not because no one was happy, but because no one wanted to reveal what horror lay behind the curtain of gums. And if you did have nice teeth, you still didn't show them. Flashing a row of healthy teeth might be seen as vain, or worse, common. Nobility was about restraint, and that included your canines. Some texts even praised women for having a small, well-shaped mouth, or lips closed like a rosebud, which is poetic code, for she doesn't laugh like a tavern wench. Showing teeth equaled lack of control, and control was the entire point of being high-born. But despite the silence around teeth, people still tried to care for them. Herbal rinses were popular: clove water sage, or wine boiled with mint. People chewed fennel seeds to freshen breath. Some scrubbed their teeth with crushed oyster shells, which removed plaque and occasionally enamel. Tooth pain, however, was handled the old-fashioned way, ignoring it until it became a religious experience. Or pulling it out with pliers. In some noble households, having blackened or missing teeth was quietly tolerated as long as you didn't smile about it. Literally. That's why makeup moved down to the lips. Red lips were prized, especially when the rest of the face was pale as parchment. Women tinted their lips with crushed berries, red wine sediment, or even mercuric sulfide. Yes, mercury again. Consistency. The contrast created the illusion of vitality, while the mouth stayed shut like a well-guarded secret. It's ironic, really. All that work to perfect a feature no one was supposed to see. But in the theater of medieval beauty, the mouth was both stage and curtain painted, brightly kept sealed. So the next time you complain about whitening strips or dental bills, take a moment to appreciate that you're allowed to smile widely without alarming anyone, and that your beauty routine doesn't involve berry paste and silent suffering. Probably. Let's talk about fashion, the medieval kind. Not the runway kind with flashing lights and photographers, but the kind where a noblewoman might spend 2 hours getting dressed just to collapse in her gown halfway through dinner. Beauty, after all, wasn't just on your face. It was built into what you wore, and more importantly, how much you suffered wearing it. Corsets weren't quite the same as the ones in later centuries, but the idea was already there. Women wore tightly laced bodices or kirtles meant to mold the body into a pleasing shape, namely small waist-lifted bust and straight posture. Think gasping hourglass, but medieval edition without the boning tech or stretchy fabrics. Getting dressed was not a solo sport. Most gowns needed to be laced from the back, pulled tight enough to adjust your organ's floor plan. It often took two people to get it right, one to hold you still, the other to yank the cords like they were ringing the church bells. And what was the reward for all this effort? Mobility? No. Comfort? Absolutely not. The goal was to move slowly, gracefully, like someone who had never needed to run from anything, especially not responsibility. On top of the corset came the layers: undergown, overgown, surcoat, fur-trimmed sleeves that could double as sails in a light breeze, necklines so stiff they could slice cheese, and hats, glorious, absurd hats. Some so wide they had to be carried separately, some so tall they brushed chandeliers. All of it said, I am rich enough to wear something this impractical. And shoes, let's just say medieval footwear, was less about arch support and more about aesthetic suffering. Pointed shoes Polaine were so long, they had to be tied to your knees to prevent tripping. They looked like duckbills with social anxiety. Color mattered too. Bright dyes were expensive. Wearing deep blues, reds, or purples was a walking bank statement. Sumptuary laws even dictated who could wear what colors, furs, or fabrics, meaning your outfit could literally be illegal if you looked too fabulous for your social rank. And then came the accessories: girdles, belts, brooches, veils, and the occasional dagger. Not for violence, though. That was a bonus, but for looking dramatically pensive at windows. Jewelry wasn't just adornment. It was narrative. A ruby ring whispered passion. A string of pearls suggested innocence. A too large necklace screamed my dowry could buy a castle. The irony, of course, is that most of this wasn't worn to be seen by crowds. Often it was just other nobles, the people who already knew how ridiculous this all was. But that was the point. Beauty in medieval fashion wasn't about comfort. It was about performance. Pain meant status. Impracticality meant power. So the next time your jeans feel tight or your shoes pinch, remember at least you didn't need a squire to help you into your underpants. Probably. Blabbly. Let's talk cheeks. In the medieval imagination, a rosy flush was the height of beauty. A pale face was fashionable, yes, but not too pale. You wanted to look like someone who just stepped out of a sacred prayer session, not someone who died in the middle of it. Enter the blush. A touch of pink on the cheeks indicated health, youth, and emotional receptivity. AKIP. I'm fertile, fragile, and full of feelings. But since actual blushing was unpredictable and relied on pesky things like emotions and circulation, medieval women found other ways to control the bloom. The first method: painted on. Crushed berries, beetroot, cochineal insects, red wine residue. These were some of the safer ingredients. The less safe options: mercury sulfide, yes again, lead oxide, or a delightful combination of vinegar and powdered clay that could irritate your skin into a semi-permanent flush. If it burns, it's working. Some women used heat to fake the effect, rubbing their cheeks vigorously with cloth to bring blood to the surface. Others pinched themselves before entering a room, arriving with cheeks glowing from sheer self-abuse. Want to look desirable? Slap yourself just right. But blushing wasn't just about looking healthy. It was about appearing emotionally open. A flush suggested modesty, excitement, even shame, which were all considered desirable traits in a woman. A woman who blushed easily was seen as more virtuous, more obedient, more likely to faint gracefully if you said ankle. Naturally, this led to performative flushing. Some women would feign embarrassment at every comment, clutching their pearls and turning their heads just so, while silently hoping their rouge hadn't smudged. But here's the deeper twist. While cheeks needed to glow, you couldn't look too confident about it. Beauty had to seem effortless, natural, like it had just happened to you while you were busy praying or sewing or doing anything appropriately humble. And that's where the balancing act began. Too little blush and you looked sickly. Too much and you looked vain, or worse, like someone who might talk back. Men wanted women who looked slightly startled by their own existence, not proud of it. Some manuals advised applying blush with one's ring finger while reciting a prayer. Because, of course, what's more holy than tinting your cheeks while asking for forgiveness? Even men weren't immune. Courtiers and poets sometimes dabbed color on their cheeks to appear more youthful, more poetic. A ruddy glow made a man seem sensitive, artistic, and possibly anemic, but in a sexy way. Ultimately, blushing in the Middle Ages was about vulnerability, or at least the performance of it. You weren't supposed to be powerful, you were supposed to be pleasing. And if that meant reddening your face with berry slaps or mild poisoning, well, all for the cause. Let's turn our attention to the hands. In the Middle Ages, hands were more than tools. They were signals, silent messengers that told others your place in the world. A rough, calloused hand said you worked. A soft, pale one said you didn't. And in a society obsessed with status, the latter was far more desirable. Noble women were expected to have delicate, almost translucent hands, fingers, long nails, short and neat skin, pale and smooth as ivory. This wasn't about function. It was about optics. Your hands weren't for doing. They were for being seen, not doing. To achieve this look, women went to surprising lengths. Lemon juice vinegar and milk baths were used to whiten the skin. Some rubbed a paste of ground almonds and honey onto their hands, then wore gloves overnight to soften them. Others dusted their fingers with chalk or rice powder before events just in case someone important caught a glimpse. And the nails, no gills, no acrylics, no neon designs, just short, clean, and unpainted. Painted nails were considered theatrical or even scandalous, better suited to performers or women of uncertain virtue. You wanted your hands to whisper nobility, not shout novelty. Of course, maintaining this illusion required not touching things. No kneading dough. No feeding livestock. No gathering firewood. Tasks that might stain or toughen the skin were delegated to servants. That's what they were there for, to protect your image, one blister at a time. Some women went so far as to avoid sun altogether. Parasols, gloves, long sleeves. It wasn't just fashion, it was protection. Tanned hands were a social misstep. Pale meant pampered. Pale meant clean. Pale meant I don't even know how to hold a rake. Interestingly, hand posture also mattered. Women were taught to gesture modestly, palms, inward fingers relaxed. No flailing, no pointing. And under no circumstance should a noblewoman ever clap. Clapping was for taverns and peasants, not for someone whose job was to nod demurely at poetry readings. Even jewelry followed the hand aesthetic. Rings were worn not to dazzle, but to decorate delicately. One on each hand, maybe two, if you were feeling rebellious. Thumb rings, scandalous. Anklets, absolutely not, though. That's another story. There was a performative stillness to noble hands. They were meant to rest in laps, fold over rosaries, or hold delicate objects like embroidery hoops or silver goblets. You didn't use your hands, you posed with them. Men weren't excluded either. Male nobles took pride in their manicured hands. A well-kept hand meant you were a thinker, a poet, a landowner. Someone whose fingers knew scrolls and chess pieces, not axes or rope. So the next time you feel bad about having ink-stained fingers or chipped nail polish, remember medieval beauty wasn't about doing. It was about appearing incapable of doing and pulling it off with powdered wrists and perfectly useless elegance. They say the eyes are the window to the soul, but in the Middle Ages, they were more like a very elaborate stained glass. Designed, curated, and occasionally hazardous to your health. Let's start with the ideal. Big round eyes, clear whites, long lashes, a soft, almost teary gaze that suggested innocence, mystery, and a strong aversion to direct sunlight. The perfect medieval stare was gentle, distant, and ever so slightly overwhelmed, like you'd just seen something wholly or terribly disappointing. But as with all beauty, nature didn't always cooperate. So medieval people got creative. To brighten the whites of their eyes, women sometimes dropped a mix of vinegar and rosewater directly into them. Refreshing, not quite. Blinding occasionally. Other recipes involved applying crushed fennel seeds or even onion juice around the eyelids to wake up the eyes. If it stung, it meant you were on the right track. Then there was belladonna, literally beautiful lady. This plant, toxic in the kind of way that ends poems early, was used in tiny drops to dilate pupils. Large pupils made your eyes look bigger, softer, more romantic. Also more like you were slowly being poisoned. Because you were. And eyeliner not black coal, like in ancient Egypt, but a softer, smudgier effect made from ash charcoal or even burnt almonds. Just enough to define the lash line without making it look like you had opinions. Bold eyeliner meant bold woman. And bold women, as we know, were often escorted directly to the edge of polite society or the stake. Coloring the lids was rare but not unheard of. Some used plant-based tints, crushed violets, or beet juice applied with a fingertip for a sleepy floral look. But too much color, and suddenly you were a harlot. Or worse, French. Lashes were meant to be long, but not too dark. Some women combed them daily with moistened twigs. Others rubbed castor oil or goose fat along the lash line to encourage growth. A few brave souls even trimmed their lashes to encourage thicker regrowth, which is either dedication or deeply flawed logic. Eyebrows, you'll remember, had already been exiled. So the eyes stood alone, unsupported, hovering like lost moons on a powdered canvas. And they had to work hard, expressing all the emotion your tightly corseted body was not allowed to. That's why so much emphasis was placed on the gaze. The way you looked at someone, the slow blink, the modest downward glance, the sudden startled widening. Entire courtships were built on a 3-second eye moment across a banquet table, followed by 6 months of gossip. Eyes were where your soul peeked out quietly in powdered disguise, sometimes crying from vinegar, but still present. They were the only part of your body allowed to be openly alive. So if you've ever fussed over your eyeliner-cursed clumpy mascara or tried to make your eyes pop in a photo rest, assured you're part of a long, burning, slightly teary tradition. So now you know. To be beautiful in the Middle Ages wasn't simply a matter of luck or good genes. It was a full-time, full-body production involving vinegar chalk-crushed beetles and the occasional bout of strategic self-inflicted itching. Looking delicate meant working hard. Looking soft meant being tough. But here's the twist: behind every powdered cheek and plucked brow was a person, a real breathing, sneezing, slightly sweaty person, trying to survive in a world that asked a lot of her and gave little in return. Beauty wasn't just vanity. It was armor, a disguise, a form of social currency. In a time when women's voices were often hushed and their choices limited, beauty was one of the few tools they could wield. If you couldn't speak, you could perform. If you couldn't rule, you could influence. And if you couldn't escape your role, you could at least decorate the walls of your cage with crushed roses and pearl powder. There's a strange kind of strength in that, because even though the standards were cruel, women found ways to bend them, to manipulate the rules, to send messages through a glance, a braid, a blush, to claim a sliver of control in a world that didn't give them much of it. And yes, some of it was absurd. The egg white face masks, the belladonna eye drops, the shoes shaped like pointy fish. But they were also expressions of something deeper, the eternal human desire to be seen, to matter, to leave a mark, even if that mark is eyeliner drawn with burnt almonds. So the next time you look in the mirror and worry about your pores, or your hairline, or your perfectly normal human flaws, just pause. Imagine trying to meet medieval standards while wearing 3 layers of wool, without central heating, and possibly being judged by a monk with questionable dental hygiene. You're doing fine. And maybe, just maybe, medieval beauty wasn't entirely about suffering. Maybe it was about longing. For attention, for approval, for a moment of softness in a world full of sharp corners. Because at the end of the day, behind every powdered face was a very tired woman who just wanted to be loved. Or at least not mistaken for a servant.